Yeah. And I think that even if you don't have an STI or you've never had an STI, looking into some of these resources on Instagram to make your maybe more informed and more aware to potentially become that safe friend for your friends if they have an STI.
Mhm.
And I think that just working on reducing your own stigma and judgments around it is beneficial as well. So even if you've never experienced it, learn more.
Mhm.
Take that opportunity to sit down and be like, okay, what are my thoughts about this? Do I have any preconceived notions about people who have STIs?
I'm Rachel, and you're listening to the Owning Your Sexual Self podcast. All right, guys, I don't mean to get too personal with you, but that's my jam. When I come across a product or something that I believe in, that I fall in love with, I have to share it with you guys. So that is why I am interrupting this episode today to tell you about Awkward Essentials, which is a company that created the drip stick, aka a cum sponge. Yes. Okay, so hear me out. When we decided that we were going to be a child-free family and Danny went to get his vasectomy, that allowed us new opportunities to have some more fun in the bedroom, and specifically fun around finishing and what that would look like for him. So afterwards, when this would happen, I would be walking around and it would just be like gooey. I feel like I just left the gynecologist's office, like dripping. And no matter how much I wiped, how much I peed, it still just felt ugh to me. All right. Then my friend told me about the drip stick, and I have been using these for over a year now. I'm obsessed. So this is the original after sex sponge, and it is specifically for absorbing excess cum. It is super soft. It's a medical grade sponge, and it quickly soaks up. Like literally, I insert it, I spin it around a couple times, I take it out, I throw it away, boom, I'm done, and then no more drippy drip throughout the day. It is seriously, it is so good. Now, I realize this is not for everybody, but for those of you that this is for you, I highly recommend going to awkwardessentials.com. You can find the link in the show here, and using code Rachel91347. That's Rachel91347. Use this code at checkout, and it's going to save you 10% on your purchase. Of course, DM me if you have any questions. I recommend getting the 20 pack or the 100 pack if you really, really like to have sex a lot. And you can also get a little trial size where they send you just a few to try out. They're super affordable too. So go check these out. Again, code is Rachel91347, awkwardessentials.com. Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another episode of Owning Your Sexual Self. I feel like I had to do my due diligence. I was just talking with Jordan. I'm like, I've had this podcast now for 3 years, and I don't think I've ever done like a generalized STI episode. I've only ever done episodes that were focused on herpes. And as someone that has a fucking podcast and a platform and influence in the world, I'm like, it's STI Awareness Month. We gotta do this. We gotta talk about this stuff. So it might not necessarily be like the most sexiest topic that we can talk about, but I have a sexy guest, and so we're going to make it sexy. I, of course, had to invite my friend Jordan onto the show today because she is really, I would deem you as an expert in this field, right, Jordan? Like, you work with women, you have conversations with women in a medical setting around STIs, you have conversations with women in the coaching setting around STIs. And I feel like you are kind of like a spokesperson for this because it is something that you talk about frequently and you have a lot of knowledge around. So thank you so much for coming on to the show today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, like you said, I talk about STIs a lot. I talk about testing, I talk about the differences. I've done lots of conversations on my podcast as well. And I think bringing awareness to it is so important, and learning how to I don't want to use the word protect yourself because that's really not the right word, but how to minimize your STI risk is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think we'll dive into as well just the shame and the stigma that comes with someone that is diagnosed with an STI. I feel like I remember growing up and hearing, you know, in high school and college and stuff, like girlfriends getting STIs like chlamydia, gonorrhea, like things like that. And I like now I can like check myself, but I would just be like, oh God, like she's so dirty. How could you ever let that happen to
What a
you?
whore.
Yeah, what a whore, what a slut, you know? And it's just the script is so different now. The direction that our sex education and the movement of sex positivity, it just yeah, like my thoughts and beliefs around STIs are so much different now. So tell us.
Well, and
Oh, go ahead.
when it comes to STIs and sex, like if you are having sex, you are potentially going to get an STI. I had a guy that I was recently dating tell me he said, you either get married or you get an STI. And, like, not that that's a true statement at all, but yeah, it's the reality of it. If you are having sex, there's probably a high chance that you are going to catch or obtain an STI at some point during your sexual exploration career,
Yeah.
however you want to phrase that.
Career, I like it. My career is having sex. I can get down with that for sure.
Yes.
So you work primarily so you work in a medical setting with women, but you also do intimacy coaching. How does the conversation, if at all, how does that conversation look different when you're in those two settings when it comes to STIs?
Yeah, I think the conversation is actually very similar. It's a lot of education,
Mm.
primarily first and foremost education. What is it? How do you reduce the risk? But then also a lot of self-acceptance and understanding that, like, hey, this is a normal part of having sex. There are lots of us who have had or do have STIs, and it just happens.
Mhm.
Period.
Yeah. And do you feel like in the medical setting that your conversations that you're having are more preventative, or is it more people are coming in with already having I guess, a diagnosis of an STI?
I would say very little from a medical standpoint, very little preventative
Mhm.
conversations.
Interesting.
And it is mostly treatment and or like they're coming in with symptoms and diagnosing and treating. And that's it. And then kind of going forward, then having the education about it. But there is very little in our medicine, in medicine currently, anyways, very little about prevention. It is all about dealing with disease. And we're not having conversations on how to prevent anything in medicine. We don't talk about how do you prevent diabetes. We're not talking about how you prevent STIs. We're not talking about how you prevent cholesterol issues or high blood pressure. Like nobody talks about that.
Mhm.
There isn't money in prevention. There's money in disease, right?
Mhm.
And unfortunately, like, yes, I work in Western medicine. Yes, I practice. However, I am very opinionated on the fact that we do need to do more prevention and education.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like you're someone that you're a good balance of the Western medicine, but also bringing in more of the holistic practices too. And I know prevention is super important to you and something that you really are like you stand behind prevention and preventative medicine.
Yeah. And I live it. I try my best. I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect, but I do try to live a preventative lifestyle.
Yeah. And it's so interesting, as you were saying, like we don't get the education around prevention, but thinking back to like my own personal high school sex ed, I remember learning about STIs. Of course, it was called STDs back then, but I remember learning about it. But then it's like I was learning about it at a time where I wasn't like super sexually active. Like I knew to use condoms, or I knew to at least have like when I was get on birth control. So I was going to the gynecologist, like having visits. I remember being asked about STIs. I remember I've been someone that's always got STI testing done. I don't know if that was again like thinking, I'm writing about this in my book right now, but like avoiding slut shaming and like that being so important to me to like not be labeled as a slut. So of course, like having an STD, then boom, I'm a slut. So it's just interesting. But then it's like, okay, yeah, maybe you got that education and that knowledge in your high school sex ed or even middle school sex ed for some people. But yeah, after the conversations, like your college, you're in out of like that educational setting, like where are the people on like influencers, right? Like on Instagram or the things that you're actually consuming and like wanting to consume, TikToks and stuff like that, where is this conversation coming into play when you're actually having sex and actually in situations where your risk might be higher than not.
Yeah, I love that. And you're right, it's not there. Like, I don't see anybody on TikTok. So I might see a little bit different than what the average consumer sees because I do follow a lot of people who are sex positive, who have STIs, who openly talk and share about it. So my content is a little bit different than the average person. And I'm sure that you would say the same probably for yours, but it's minimal. It's very minimal. And we're not getting that out there. For me, when I was in school, my STI conversations were very much so like, you can get this. And my interpretation of it was your sex life is over. If you get an
Mm-hmm.
STI, your sex life is done. And the reality is, like, that's not true. Most STIs are actually treatable
Mm-hmm.
with antibiotics or some type of medication. And if they're not treatable, they are manageable. Literally all of them. And so we've created this stigma and created this view of STIs as bad. But at the end of the day, like, you get strep throat, you go to the doctor, you get an antibiotic. How is that different than getting gonorrhea? You go to the doctor, you get an antibiotic.
Mm-hmm.
Is that different?
Yeah. Yeah, God, like such a great comparison for sure. Because that's what I was thinking when you were speaking. I'm like, yeah, if I get strep throat, which I'm someone that has got strep throat, I feel like every year since I've been a child, no one is coming at me like, ew, you're gross, you have strep throat, like they might be, oh, stay away from me, like I don't want to get sick either. But yeah, why is it any different? It's because, well, I know why. It's because it's happening through sex and people are scared to talk about sex and it's such a taboo thing. And God, yeah, it's like all of this shame, most of this shame, anyways, can be eliminated if we just have more frequent conversations around sex and sexuality and intimacy.
Yeah.
And
And that's why we do what we do. That's why we're having this podcast episode today, is to just talk about that, because you're right. Like, if we have more open conversations and people are more comfortable with the topic, it's going to make it less stigmatized right there.
mm-hmm. Yeah. So
And if
in
you look around, like, if you look at your friends and your friend group and you ask them, because you may or may not have had these conversations with your friend group, but chances are, at least one friend in your friend group who has had an STI, and probably more than that.
mm-hmm. Yeah, in that, or they're not talking about it, right? They're so embarrassed
Yes.
people that they're not sharing even with their closest friends, which is
Yeah.
also sad. You like have this thing that's happening to you and then you can't, like, you feel like you can't share it with somebody because there's so much shame that you're holding on to there.
Yeah, I remember when I got my STI diagnosis, that was the first time that I learned that some of the people in my friend group or people that I have known had STIs, and I had no clue. Like, that had never been a conversation until I openly had brought that up.
Yeah. And so in your practice, what are some of the common STIs that you see coming in?
So, yeah, let's run through kind of all of them, and then we'll talk a little bit about the common ones. Now, gonorrhea, chlamydia are definitely some of the most common ones. You have syphilis, HIV, HPV, human papillomavirus, HSV, herpes, and there are a couple others called marcoplasm and ureaplasm, which you probably have not heard of. There are They are the new STIs. I believe the CDC made a publication about 2015, or the WHO, one of the governing bodies, right around 2015, announced that these are officially STIs. And then something to be aware of is that there is a new superbug of gonorrhea, chlamydia,
Mm.
that is out. I haven't done a lot of research about it, but it is very resistant to a lot of different treatments.
Mm.
And it is in the Europe at this point, but there have been cases found in the US in the last, I want to say like 6 months or so.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. Thank you for giving us that rundown. And yeah, I've not heard of those two new ones. Chlamydia and gonorrhea, definitely, or HSV, HPV, which it's also my understanding that pretty much everybody has HPV. Is that correct?
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
yeah, we just,
75% of sexually active women will have HPV. And the interesting thing with that is that men are not tested. So if you are in a heteronormative relationship, there is no screening tool for men. There is no standard screening for women. The only time you're screened is on abnormal pap smears, or if you're over the age of 30 and you have a pap smear, sometimes they do that routinely with your pap smear. But other than that, there is no routine screening. You don't go in and say, hey, test me for HPV. It's one of those things where it's just kind of accepted that a lot of us have HPV and it goes away on its own. There's nothing that you do about it. And that's that.
I remember when I was like 16ish, I became sexually active at the age of 14. And I remember getting pushed the Gardasil shot, like when I was in that 15, 16, 17. And I feel like there was like multiple shots that I had to get for that. And I remember again, like so much fear within me around getting an STI. And so I got them, but those are more, the Gardasil shots were more preventative for HPV. Is that correct?
So when you and I got the HPV vaccines, they only covered for a couple of the strands of HPV. There's over 100 different strands of HPV, and only a couple of them will cause cervical cancer, and only a couple of them lead to genital warts. And so a lot of them are benign, doesn't really impact anything.
Mm-hmm.
But we covered for just a subset. The current strand, or like the current vaccine, I believe covers for 13 of them. But again, it's not all of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's nothing really out there that's going to protect you from every single STI that's out there, right? Like we are humans, things are going to happen to us that we will then have to manage when that time comes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Something I wanted to bring up about the STIs is that, we kind of ran through the general ones. Hepatitis C is also considered an STI as well. But some of them are spread via like fluids, and some of them are spread via skin. And I think that that's a really important distinction to make, because even if you are using condoms, you're practicing quote safe sex, whatever that means, which we will come back to that, but you're practicing safe sex and you are still potentially at risk for getting an STI.
Mm-hmm. And
So
does that go beyond, like if you're kissing somebody with a cold sore or somebody has an open cut and you're rubbing up against that cut? When you say skin contact, like what does that look like so people can just be aware?
yeah, so skin contact would be with these ones in particular where they're virally shedding. So, like with HSV, if you have a cold sore and you go down on somebody or you kiss them, you can spread that. And with like syphilis, those a lot of times are open lesions that are on the genitalia. Sometimes they can be internally and you're not going to see them or know that they're there. And that can spread that way as well. And then you have HPV that spread via skin to skin. It's not like you just rub up, but when you think of like warts, hand warts, other types of warts, that's actually a strand of HPV as well. And so it's just kind of being aware that like some like skin to skin, think of having sex, a condom only covers so much. And there's a lot of skin touching, and there are a lot of different things that could be spread via the skin.
Interesting. So if somebody had something on testicles or perineum, right? Like condoms are not covering those areas of the body.
Yep.
Fascinating. Yeah. So
Same with like the vulva.
yeah.
Like the vulva is not covered by condoms unless you're using maybe a dental dam. But the vulva, the only thing that, when you're using male condoms is probably the vaginal canal, but the whole vulva is exposed to skin.
Mm-hmm. Mm. I'm glad we're having this conversation. I think this is going to be so eye-opening for a lot of people. And so you mentioned that most are treatable. So if you give us some common symptoms that somebody with an STI might start to experience, and at what point then do they not Google and just talk to a doctor instead?
So the interesting thing is most of them are asymptomatic.
Mm.
Now, we will talk about what symptoms can look like, but a lot of the times you have no symptoms at all. And the only way you're going to know if you have an STI is having routine testing. So, making sure, depending on the frequency of new sexual partners or what that looks like for you, some people are tested monthly, some are tested quarterly, some are tested twice a year, some are tested yearly. Depends on how often you have sex and what the parameters are of that relationship or the context of your sexual encounters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember when I worked with domestic and sexual assault survivors, when survivors of rape would come in, and they would have the same exams and they would screen for STIs in that exam. And that's where I learned what you just said, is that some lie dormant for so long. Some STIs don't even show up until months later, because I remember the nurses, when they were talking to the patients, they would say, okay, we're testing you now, but you also want to get tested again 6 months from now, and how important that was. And in my own experience, so I was in college essentially, like, learning this, and every time I go to my gynecology, and even sometimes my primary care visits, I'm asking to be screened for STIs, because, and they always look at, I've been with my husband now for 10 years, and they just look at me like, they ask me, have you had any other sexual partners? I'm like, no. Are you, but it's like, I know internally that these things cannot show up for years and years and years later. Like, who knows? And why not be better safe than sorry, right?
Well, and I think, the good timeline to use is like a 6 month period. HIV in particular is about a 6 month window before you would potentially see that on your test results.
Mm.
Now, gonorrhea, chlamydia, if you have a sexual encounter, waiting about 14 days before doing testing is probably going to be best, because of the fact that it may not show. It may be the viral load may not be high enough, or like the bacterial load, I guess you could say, may not be high enough to be detected
Mhm.
right afterwards. Like if you had intercourse and you go right away afterwards to get tested, probably isn't going to show. But the incubation period is about 14 days. And so after that, so it depends on which one we are specifically talking about. But yeah, like 6 months for HIV.
Wow. And if you're not going to the doctor that regularly, what other options do people have if they were wanting to get testing done on a regular basis?
Yes. So I am a huge fan of at-home test kits. I don't I don't have health insurance. As a medical provider, I don't have health insurance. And so the test kits at home are super affordable. I mean, we're talking, I say that loosely, like they're not necessarily affordable, but they are much cheaper than if I go to have a doctor's visit, get the blood work. That is going to be a couple $100, where the at-home test kits are generally about 100 to 150.
Mhm.
And you do it in the privacy of your home. They mail it to you. You have to get a little bit of a urine sample, you get a blood sample, you put it in the box, and you drop it off at the post office. So easy, so simple. I personally love that. That is how I've done all of my testing literally the last 3 years, because it's just so much easier, and for me more cost effective, being somebody who doesn't have insurance. There are some home test kits that do take insurance. So if you have
Mm.
health insurance, take a look around. There are so many different carriers for the home kits. You have Everlywell, you have, I believe Nurex does it now too, TBH, Innovative Health Diagnostics. I mean, so many different places. It also just depends on what state you're in, because some places can do testing in certain states and some cannot. It just, there's a lot of if and buts. So do some research.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, Everlywell is who I generally go through for my home testing. I do have a discount link that I'll share in the show notes for people if you're wanting to get, I believe it gives you like 10 or 20% off your tests. And they have all kinds of home tests that you can do on there. Hormone panels, thyroid testing, food sensitivity. I've done several of them through them. So yeah, okay. So another question I wanted to ask you was, when somebody is seeing a doctor, as I said, I remember luckily like having enough information, like advocating for myself, but for somebody that maybe isn't as privileged in this knowledge and this education, what questions do you recommend that they're asking their medical providers?
Yeah. So I would recommend asking them to be tested, first of all. Now, when you ask them to be tested, a lot of times they're going to test you for, quote, the main four: gonorrhea, chlamydia, maybe HIV, and syphilis. That's probably it. If you want some additional testing, you are probably going to have to advocate for yourself and say, hey, no, I want HSV. I want, sometimes they can do the mycoplasma, ureaplasm. That one's actually pretty hard to get tested. It's not mainstream testing yet. If you go to a Planned Parenthood, I do believe that they have access to the testing, but I know like a lot of the practices that I've worked at, it's not something that a lot of people are aware of yet, and the testing just isn't there and the access to it. So when you go in, you definitely have to advocate and say, hey, I want tested, but I want these specific ones, not just your standard urine test or the urine in the blood. So that would be the first thing. The other thing I would ask, so say you do get a diagnosis of an STI, something that I would highly recommend asking is, how long should I abstain from sex after this? And does my partner need to be treated? Can you treat them? Or do they need to go see a doctor themselves or a provider themselves? Because a lot of us, we are able to go ahead and treat your partner as long as they don't have any antibiotic allergies or nothing there. Like a lot of times we're able to treat your partner. The other thing I would also ask or strongly encourage, most providers probably aren't going to have a ton of resources available for you. So I would probably encourage getting on Instagram. I know this sounds really crazy, but get on Instagram and follow some people who talk openly about STIs. One of my favorites is Courtney Bram. I know you've had him on the podcast before, but he openly talks about his HSV diagnosis as well as his prior experience with chlamydia. And so being able to find some community in other people who have had other STIs can be really helpful. That's the first person that comes to mind, of just finding that community and that tribe to help support you too. The CDC has good information. I also feel like sometimes it lacks in that it's very clinical and goes back to the don't have sex, you're going to get an STI conversation, and it is very stigma induced. So if you want very clinical, technical, data-based information, go there, but also note that you're going to have that underlying stigma there, and the CDC is working on it.
All such great information. Yes, I love Courtney. I love his account. And I think I'm a proponent of searching hashtags on specific things that I want to learn about. And so if you search on Instagram, even just STI, STD, STI conversations, STI advocacy, even spelling it out, sexually transmitted infections, I think that you're going to find accounts on there of people that are openly talking about it. Check out their bio, see if they seem, trustworthy and whatnot. But yeah, and I think that's too for people that do have some shame around this, or maybe are embarrassed to be looking up information or wanting information on this. Instagram is such an easy way for you to kind of like fly under the radar, because we follow people all the time. No one's going to be like, oh my God, I can't believe you're following this person, right? And I think too, another piece of this is like we spoke on this a little bit more, but in the beginning, but having conversations with friends around STIs, like what are their thoughts around STIs? Have they ever had an experience with it? Do they know anybody that's had an experience with it? What did they do in their situations? Like opening up that platform to have non-judgmental conversations around these things, I think is so important. And in your friend group, right, like who you can push these boundaries with, essentially.
Yeah. And I think that even if you don't have an STI or you've never had an STI, looking into some of these resources on Instagram to make your maybe more informed and more aware to potentially become that safe friend for your friends if they have an STI.
Mhm.
And I think that just working on reducing your own stigma and judgments around it is beneficial as well. So even if you've never experienced it, learn more.
Mhm.
Take that opportunity to sit down and be like, okay, what are my thoughts about this? Do I have any preconceived notions about people who have STIs?
Mhm.
And take some time to do some internal work on that too, so that, when it happens, because it's going to happen, 75% of women have HPV. When it happens, um, you can be able to say, oh, yeah, I've learned about this. And, you know, I know other people who have it, and you can be the person to share the resources too to help them. For me, Instagram and the resources was one of the best things that happened to me when I got my STI diagnosis, because all of a sudden I found community and I was like, oh, wow, you can still have a sex life.
Mhm.
I didn't know that with herpes, you can still have a sex life. Like that for me was not something like didn't have the right education.
Mhm.
And so I was able to find the community and find the support, which made my experience having that diagnosis totally different than how it would have been if I've never found those resources.
Mhm. Yeah. And so important, especially and you can listen to earlier episodes on this around specifically herpes, but the conversations around disclosing, setting boundaries when it's quote unquote safe to have sex, when it's not, what to do during an outbreak, all these different things that, just like with anything, you lose a parent, you reach out to a community for support, perhaps, right? Like, so you're coming out, you're transitioning, right? You have support systems around the things that you're experiencing in life. And I think that's so important. And again, especially going back to something that is generally deemed as shameful in the stigma in our society.
Well, and I think that we should also talk too about how you don't need an STI or that experience to be having better conversations with your partners to minimize your risk.
Mm.
So, depending on what your relationship context looks like, are you in monogamous, non monogamous, multiple partners, one partner? What does that look like? But having those conversations to, we're not just preventing pregnancy potentially, right? Or maybe you're attempting pregnancy, but for the concept of quote safe sex, there's so much more. Like safety is emotional safety. Safety is physical safety. Safety is protecting you from potentially STIs or minimizing your risk of getting an STI. It could also mean preventing pregnancy, depending on your situation. And having these conversations is so much more than throw a condom on it and you're good to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, this was such a good episode. I'm so happy that we did this. Like I said, it's not the most sexiest of topics, but it's so necessary.
Yeah.
It truly is.
There
And
was one thing I did want to add before we wrap up. You had asked earlier about symptoms. So, like I said, most of the time it is probably asymptomatic, but there are some symptoms that you potentially would experience that should be kind of clues to go see a provider, go to the doctor, do some testing. One of those would be burning with urination. So, burning, discharge, odor, any of those things, that would be a good reason to go in to see a provider, to be evaluated. If you notice any lesions, go in. Could be an ingrown hair, could be herpes, could be syphilis. There's no way to know unless you go get tested.
Mhm.
And so strongly recommend, just if anything feels off, go in. When it comes to some of the other STIs, common symptoms are general fatigue, fever, just not feeling well. And you would potentially disclose it or disguise it as like COVID or the flu or even a cold, and maybe not even notice that it is potentially STI symptoms. So routine screening is really important. But if you ever do notice something that just doesn't feel right, go in. Your provider is going to be more than happy to help guide you in the right way and be like, oh, yeah, this is what it looks like. Or, no, maybe you have bacterial vaginosis or a yeast infection. Those are not STIs. But that is still something that can give you some similar symptoms. Could even be a UTI for some people.
Yeah. Again, which STI, not an STI, both are treated by antibiotics.
Yep.
Yes. Well, thank you again so much, Jordan, for coming on and having this conversation. I think this was super, super helpful, eye-opening for a lot of people. And I wanted to add to it at the end there when you were saying, you know, you said your doctor will be more than happy to help you. And if they're not, get a new doctor. Like, advocate for your fucking self around this. You know, like, again, when my doctor looked at me like I had 3 heads, like, what do you mean you want to be STI tested? Yeah, there was like that layer of judgment, like he probably thinks I'm out here just fucking around. But yeah, it is so important for you to advocate for yourself around these things.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, and that if you don't feel safe to bring these questions up, or you're met with resistance or hesitation, advocate for yourself. Find somebody different. You know, I know there are some projects going on trying to identify like sex positive providers and create like resource lists. I know Courtney Bram is working on it, but that is a really good tool as well. Also, I will say, like, Planned Parenthood generally is going to be a more sex positive space as well. If you go to some of the clinics where they solely focus on STIs and pregnancy, those places typically will be a little bit more sex positive and understanding compared to maybe like your general primary care doctor or OBGYN.
Yeah, especially if they're not up with the times.
Yes, also that.
Yeah. All right. Well, if people want to get in contact with you, I know you've been on the show several times, but just in case we have a first timer, how can people find you and connect with you?
Yes, you can find me on Instagram at Jordan Donnell, JordanDannelle. You can also find my podcast, Vaginas, Vulvas, and Vibrators, anywhere that you listen to podcasts at.
Yes, and lots of more STI episodes on Jordan's podcast, and lots of good just medical advice, and maybe not advice, medical information and education around sex related things for sure, because she is a PA, in case I didn't mention that. She's got the credentials. She knows what she's talking about. I don't bring just like random people on this podcast. So
I love it. Thank you for having me, Rachel. It's always a
yes.
pleasure to talk with you.
Yes. Thank you. I love you so much. I can't wait to see you soon. And thanks again. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you loved it, be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. And if you really fucking loved it, make sure to tag me on social media at @TheRachelMain. I'll see you next week.